The morning Levi Granger rode back into Caldwell, Kansas. He was carrying 10 years of guilt on his back like a stone saddle, and the horse beneath him, a striking Appaloosa mare with a constellation of spots across her haunches, was the very proof of everything he had done wrong. The year was 1884, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip, a place where dusty ambitions and hard lives had been pressing themselves into the red earth for long enough that the buildings finally looked like they belonged there. The main street was alive with the particular noise of a Thursday morning, a wagon loaded with dry goods rolling past the mercantile, two cowhands arguing outside the saloon, a blacksmith already hammering iron in the early heat. None of it looked the way it had in Levi's memory, and yet all of it looked exactly the same. He kept his hat low and his pace steady, the Appaloosa picking her way down the packed dirt street with the kind of quiet dignity that only a well-bred horse carries. She was older now, 11 years old by his count, her muzzle shot through with gray and her gait a little more careful than the wild, electric thing he remembered from the night he had taken her. But her markings were unmistakable. Anyone who had known Juniper, and that was what the original owner had called her, he had found that out much later, would know her on sight. Levi had ridden from New Mexico territory, and the trip had taken him 12 days. 12 days of rehearsing what he would say when he arrived. 12 days of talking himself out of turning around and going back to the quiet little spread he had built for himself outside of Santa Fe, where nobody knew what he had been before he became a man trying to be decent. He had covered roughly 700 miles on the back of a horse he owed to someone else, and with every mile, the weight of what he was about to do had grown heavier and more complicated, and also, in some strange way he could not fully explain, more necessary. The town had changed since he was last here. There was a new hotel on the western end of the main street, a proper one with 2 stories and a painted sign that read Caldwell Grand. The old livery had been expanded. A women's hat shop occupied a space that Levi was fairly certain used to be a gambling house. He scanned the street carefully, looking for the sign he had written down in his memory from 10 years ago, Blackwell Ranch Supplies, but did not find it in its old location. That made his stomach tighten. It did not necessarily mean anything. A lot could shift in a decade. He pulled up in front of the livery and swung down from the saddle, leading Juniper inside with a gentle hand on her bridle. The liveryman, a broad-shouldered fellow with a sunburned neck and a missing front tooth, looked up from where he was pitching hay. "Passing through or staying?" the man asked. "Staying a day, maybe 2, Levi said. "She needs good feed and a clean stall." "I would appreciate a careful hand with her." "Fine-looking Appaloosa," the liveryman said, coming closer to look her over. His eyes traveled across her flank markings with a slow, professional appreciation. Then he stopped. His expression changed just slightly, the way a man's face changes when he is trying to work something out but does not want to say it yet. "You know, I have seen a horse with markings just like these, long time back though." "Is that right?" Levi said, keeping his voice even. "Yeah." "Belonged to the Blackwell family. Walter Blackwell's place was out on the South Fork Road. Fine ranch, used to be." The liveryman took Juniper's bridle and led her to an open stall. "You buying or selling?" "Neither," Levi said. "I am looking to find the Blackwell place. Is Walter Blackwell still out on the South Fork Road?" The liveryman was quiet for a moment, and the quality of that quiet told Levi something even before the words came. "Walter Blackwell passed on, going on 4 years now. His daughter Ruth runs the place. Does well enough, considering. South Fork Road, about 3 miles out, just past the old cottonwood stand. You cannot miss the gate, she painted it white." Levi nodded slowly. "Thank you." He paid the liveryman for 2 nights and walked back out into the heat of the morning street. A daughter. Walter was gone. He had prepared himself for a confrontation with an angry man. Walter Blackwell had a reputation in this territory in 1874 that suggested he would not take the theft of a prized horse with any kind of calm, and that reputation had been one of the reasons a frightened, reckless 22-year-old version of Levi had not come back sooner. He had told himself it was wisdom to wait. In his quieter moments, he had always known it was fear. But the situation had shifted entirely now, and he was not sure that made it simpler or more complicated. He decided to clean himself up before he rode out. It did not seem right to arrive covered in trail dust, looking like the exact kind of drifter that the woman running the Blackwell ranch had probably learned to be cautious about. He went to the hotel and paid for a room, boiled himself some wash water in the basin, shaved the 12 days of road off his face, and put on the cleanest shirt he had brought. He was 32 years old, brown-haired and broad through the shoulders, with quiet gray eyes and hands that showed every year of hard ranch work he had done since he finally put the worst of himself behind him. He looked in the small, cracked mirror above the basin and did not feel like a man going to do something brave. He felt like a man going to do something that was simply long overdue, and those two things were not always the same. He ate a quick noon meal at the town's small restaurant, salt pork and beans and black coffee, and then went back to the livery for Juniper. The liveryman watched him lead her out with that same almost knowing expression, but said nothing more. The South Fork Road was exactly where the liveryman had described, a rutted track that wound between rolling grassland and the occasional cluster of cottonwood and willow that marked where the creek bent close to the surface. It was a good piece of country, Levi thought, open and big-skied, the kind that made you feel both small and grateful at the same time. He could understand why a family had built their life here. The white gate appeared at the end of a long straight stretch of road, just as described. Beyond it, a white 2-story house sat at the center of a well-kept property. A long porch ran the full width of the front. A kitchen garden grew in a fenced patch to the east side of the house. To the west, separated by a neat post-endrail fence, was a horse pasture where 3 animals grazed, and beyond that, a proper barn, red-painted, with a smaller structure beside it that appeared to be a tack room or equipment shed. The whole place had the look of somewhere that was kept up by someone who took real pride in it and worked very hard to maintain that pride. Levi stopped Juniper at the gate. He sat there for a moment just breathing, and the mare turned her head back toward him as if she could sense his hesitation. He reached forward and ran a hand down her neck. "I know," he said quietly. "We are both a long way from where we started." He dismounted, opened the gate, and led her through on foot. He figured riding straight up to the door of a woman living alone was not the kind of approach that inspired trust, especially when a man was carrying the particular combination of confession and history that he was carrying. He walked the length of the approach road on foot, Juniper walking beside him with her nose occasionally bumping against his shoulder in the way she had developed over the years, a habit that always made him feel the guilt more sharply rather than less. He was about 40 yards from the porch when the front door opened. The woman who stepped out was perhaps 28 or 29, tall for a woman of this time and place, with dark brown hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed sun hat, and a working dress in a dark blue color that she wore with the comfortable ease of someone who had never much concerned herself with whether her clothes were fashionable. She had sharp, watchful eyes, dark, the kind of eyes that looked at things carefully before deciding what to make of them. She was drying her hands on an apron, and she had clearly been in the middle of something when she heard someone on the road. She stood on the porch and looked at him and at the horse, and her hands went still in the apron. "Can I help you?" she called. Her voice was clear and direct, without particular alarm in it, but with the particular caution that a woman alone on a ranch had very sensibly developed. "Miss Blackwell," Levi said, stopping at a respectful distance from the porch steps. He held Juniper's lead rein loosely, not hiding the horse, letting the woman see her clearly. "Mrs. Blackwell," she said, and then, as if correcting herself, "Well, Miss Blackwell now, Ruth Blackwell, what is your business?" He had known, standing there, that there were roughly 100 different ways this conversation could go, and that the only way to navigate any of them was to simply begin. He took his hat off. He held it in front of him not as a gesture of polite theater but because it gave his hand something to do. "My name is Levi Granger. I came here from Santa Fe, New Mexico territory. I rode here to bring back this horse." He paused. "Her name is Juniper. She belonged to your father. I took her in the summer of 1874 from a stock pen on the edge of Caldwell. I took her without permission and without payment, and I rode out of this territory, and I did not come back until now. I am sorry for what I did, and I am sorry it took this long to come and say it." The silence after that was one of the longer silences Levi had ever stood inside of. Ruth Blackwell looked at him. Then she looked at the horse. Her expression went through several things he could not fully read from where he stood: recognition, he thought, and something else, something more complicated. She came down the porch steps slowly and walked toward the mare with the unhurried focus of someone who needed to verify something before they decided how to feel about it. She reached up and ran her hand along Juniper's jaw, and the mare turned into the touch in a way that she had not with the liveryman, a way that spoke of something older, something remembered. Ruth's jaw tightened. Her eyes held a brightness that was not quite tears but was close to them. "This is Juniper," she said quietly, not to Levi but more to herself. "She has gone gray around the muzzle." "She is 11 years old," Levi said. "She has been well kept. She has had good feed and good shelter, and she has not been overworked. I want you to know that." Ruth stepped back from the horse. She looked at Levi with those sharp, thoughtful eyes, and he made himself hold her gaze, because looking away would have been the easy thing, and he was done taking the easy road when the decent one was available. "You stole her when I was 19 years old," Ruth said. Her voice was very controlled. "My father was beside himself. Juniper was out of a mare that had been in our family since my mother brought her from Tennessee. She was the only foal that mare ever dropped. My father reported the theft to the marshal, and the marshal did exactly nothing. We never heard a word about her, not one word in 10 years. She stopped. She looked at the horse again and then back at him. And now you come walking up my road." "Yes," Levi said simply. 10 years, Mr. Granger." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. Then she did something he had not expected. She said, "Tie her to the post and come up on the porch. I will get us some water." He had been prepared for anger. He had even been prepared for a rifle. He had not been prepared for water on the porch, and it unsettled him in a way he thought was probably good for him. He tied Juniper to the post rail at the front of the house, where the mare immediately dropped her head and began pulling at the grass growing along the base of the fence with the perfectly ordinary contentment of a well-traveled horse who had found somewhere comfortable to stop. Levi climbed the steps and stood at the edge of the porch, turning his hat in his hands. Ruth came back out with a tin pitcher and 2 cups, set them on the small table between the 2 chairs, and sat in one. She gestured at the other. Levi sat. She poured. She handed him a cup. He drank because his mouth was dry and because the water was cold from the well and extraordinarily good after the heat of the road. "Now," Ruth said, folding her hands in her lap with a deliberateness that suggested she had decided to be very calm about this, "tell me why you came back. 10 years, you say nothing, you do nothing. You could have sold her in New Mexico and nobody in this territory would ever have known. So why now?" Levi turned the cup in his hands. This was the part he had rehearsed the least, because the honest answer was not a simple one, and he had never been entirely sure anyone else would understand it. But honesty was the only thing he had brought with him that was truly worth anything. "I built a ranch," he said. "A small one outside Santa Fe. Took me years to get it to where it was actually running well, paying its own way, able to support a man properly. And when it did, when I finally had something that was mine, that I had built and earned and could be proud of, I thought about how I had started it." He paused. "The first money I had when I came to New Mexico was what I made selling a horse I had stolen. Not Juniper. I was never able to sell Juniper because I had already gotten used to riding her by the time I thought I could, and then I kept her. But the money I used for my first winter, for my first supplies, for the lease on the first piece of land I worked, That money came from stock I had no right to, and I have thought about that every year since." Ruth was watching him with that careful expression, neither warm nor cold, just very present and attentive. "I also thought about the man I stole from," Levi continued. "I heard last year from a man passing through Santa Fe who had come up from Kansas that Walter Blackwell had passed. I did not know him personally, but I knew of him. I knew he had spent time and energy and anger over this loss, and I thought, I cannot give that back to him now. I cannot apologize to him." He stopped and looked at the worn brim of his hat. "But I can come back. I can bring back what I took, and I can say plainly to whoever will hear it that I was wrong and I am sorry for it. That is why I came." The afternoon light was doing something beautiful on the hills behind the ranch, the kind of late golden quality that Kansas got in late summer, and Levi became briefly and absurdly aware of how different this conversation was from everything he had imagined during 12 days of riding. Ruth was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then she said, "Keep the horse." Levi blinked. "I beg your pardon. Keep the horse," Ruth repeated, without any particular heat or drama. "She has been yours for 10 years. She is used to you. Taking her back from you now at her age and putting her in a new pasture would upset her for no good reason." She looked at him steadily. "My father loved that horse deeply, and when she was gone it hurt him in a way that I think you should know about. But my father has been gone 4 years and Juniper is 11 years old and she has clearly been well cared for by you, and I am not interested in making this into more theater than it needs to be." She paused. "What I want is for you to explain to me, more fully than you just did, what brought you to the point of doing something like this. Not now, over supper." That surprised him even more than the instruction to keep the horse. "Over supper," he repeated. "I live alone on this ranch, Mr. Granger. My nearest neighbor is Pete Harlan, and he is 73 years old and mostly deaf. I do not often get the opportunity to talk to someone who has ridden 700 miles for a reason I find genuinely interesting. I made a stew this morning and there is more of it than I need." She stood up, a straightening movement that was clean and decisive. "You are welcome to sleep in the barn. I have 2 hands who come in the day but go home in the evenings, the Cortez brothers, Manuel and Tomas. They are good men and they will be here at sunup if you are still about and behave yourself." Levi stood too. "Miss Blackwell, Ruth," she said, in a tone that suggested she was making a practical adjustment and not an invitation to familiarity. "I have not answered to Miss since my husband died 3 years ago, and Mrs. is too formal for someone sitting on a porch in an apron." He absorbed that a husband then dead 3 years, which meant she had been widowed at around 25 or 26. He felt the weight of that alongside everything else and said only, "Thank you," for the water and the supper and the reasonable response to a situation that was not reasonable. Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, but it changed her face considerably. "I will be the judge of whether you deserve thanks for any of it after supper," she said. "The barn is around the west side. There is hay and a water barrel. Help yourself and be back at the house by 6. She went inside, and Levi stood on the porch for a moment looking at Juniper, who continued to graze with absolute indifference to the considerable weight of the moment just concluded. "Well," he said to the mare, "that was not what I expected." He untied her and led her around to the barn, which was clean and well organized and smelled of good hay and horses, and the particular combination of oil and leather that meant the tack was well maintained. He found an empty stall, saw to Juniper's water and feed, and then sat down on the hay bales at the back of the barn in the cooling afternoon air and tried to understand what exactly had just happened. He had come to return a horse and confess a wrong. He had expected, at best, to be chased off the property after a thorough dressing down. Instead, he had been given water on a porch and invited to supper and offered the horse back. And the woman who had done all of this was someone who had apparently looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes and decided he was at minimum interesting enough to feed. He was not sure if he felt better or more confused. He suspected both. The supper was stew, as promised beef and potato and dried chili, rich and heavy, and exactly the kind of food a man needed after 12 days on the road. Ruth set the table with the particular efficiency of someone who lived alone and had reduced all domestic tasks to their most functional form. But there was a cloth on the table and the dishes matched, and she had put a small glass of water beside each plate without being asked, and Levi found all of this more touching than was perhaps rational. She sat across from him and they ate, and in the way of people who have both been somewhat lonely for different lengths of time, they talked more freely than either of them might have expected. He told her about the years between, about being young and broke and stupid in 1874, about the particular kind of desperation that makes a man do things he knows he should not do. He had been 22 that summer, working a cattle drive that had gone badly wrong due to bad management, and he had been paid almost nothing for 3 months of brutal work, and had been left in Caldwell with $8, no horse, and no good plan. He had walked past the Blackwell stock pen on a Friday night and seen the Appaloosa and done what hungry, stupid young men sometimes do when they are not yet the people they will eventually become. "I do not say that as an excuse," he said. "I say it because you asked me to tell you the whole story, and that is the whole story. Poverty does not make theft right, it only explains the thinking." Ruth ate and listened and nodded. "How old are you now?" she asked. 32. "And you spent 10 years becoming someone worth being and then rode back here. That is one way to put it. Is there another way?" He thought about it. "I spent 10 years becoming someone who could not look at himself in the mirror without thinking about this particular thing, and one day I decided I was tired of that." She was quiet for a moment. She poured them each more coffee from the pot on the stove, real coffee, not the chicory substitute that many ranches ran on in lean times, and then sat back with her cup and looked at him across the table. "My father never got over it," she said at last, and her voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something underneath it that was not. Not because of the horse itself, though he loved Juniper, but because he had worked hard all his life to build something honest in a place where honesty was not always the easiest road. He believed in it the way some men believe in religion. And when someone took something from him without cause and without asking and without consequence, it shook something in him. I think it made him feel that the world he had tried to build was less real than he had thought. Levi was quiet. He had not known that. He had not known anything about Walter Blackwell except the reputation, and the reputation had not included the interior life of the man. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it in a way that was deeper than the words. Ruth looked at him, and something in her expression acknowledged that she could see the difference between the kind of sorry that is just a word and the kind that comes from somewhere real. "I know you are," she said. "Otherwise you would not have come." They talked for another hour after supper, doing the dishes side by side in a comfortable rhythm that arrived more naturally than seemed logical for two strangers. And he told her about New Mexico, and she told him about running the ranch alone after her husband Daniel had died of a fever that swept through the territory in the winter of 1881. Daniel Blackwell had been her father's choice as much as her own. She said a decent enough man, not unkind, but not someone she had chosen with her whole heart in the way she might have if she had been older or less obedient to the practical considerations of the time. "I was 23, she said, handing him a washed plate to dry. "He was 30. My father liked him. He knew cattle and he knew the land. I married him because all of those things were good reasons, and I thought that was enough." Levi dried the plate carefully. "Was it enough?" "For a while," she said simply. "Then, it is not a tragedy. I had 3 years with a decent man who treated me well, and then he died. And now I have a ranch and I make my own decisions, and I am not sure I would trade that for what most women my age have." She glanced at him sideways. "I am aware that is an unusual thing to say." "It is an honest thing," Levi said. "I find I prefer honest things." She smiled at that, a real one, brief and slightly surprised at itself, and turned back to the wash basin. He slept in the barn that night on clean hay, with Juniper in the stall beside him making the quiet sounds horses make when they are at ease, and he lay on his back and looked up at the lantern-lit rafters and felt something he had not felt in a long time, something he did not immediately have a name for. It was somewhere between peace and the anticipation of something that had not yet arrived. He was up before sunrise, as was his habit on the ranch, and he went to the water barrel and washed his face in the blue early light. He heard movement in the house and then saw a lamp go on in the kitchen window, and he stood in the barnyard for a moment breathing the morning, the smell of hay and earth and distant rain somewhere over the hills to the west. When Ruth came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without preamble, it felt like something that had already been established between them, and the ordinariness of it struck him as remarkable. "Manuel and Tomas will be here in an hour," she said. "I have a fence section down in the east pasture. I was going to ask them to handle it today, but I was going to help them. There are a lot of posts to reset." "I can help with a fence," Levi said. She looked at him over her cup. "You are not obligated." "I know I am not," she considered. "All right, thank you." The Cortez brothers arrived as predicted, 2 stocky, sun-weathered Mexican men in their 30s, Manuel the elder and Tomas the younger, who greeted Ruth with easy familiarity and looked at Levi with the particular watchful reserve of men who had learned to assess strangers quickly. Levi recognized that look and did not take it personally. He introduced himself, gave a brief and honest explanation of his presence, leaving out the more complicated historical parts, but saying plainly that he had come to return a horse he had once taken from this ranch, and that Ruth had been kind enough to let him stay and work a day. And both men seemed to find that acceptable enough to proceed without further examination. They worked the fence line all morning, digging out rotted posts, setting new ones, stretching the wire tight and clean. It was hot, physical work under a Kansas summer sun, and Levi found himself sliding into the comfortable wordless rhythm of shared labor, the kind that had always suited him better than most forms of human interaction. Tomas was the talker of the 2 brothers, and he narrated the work with a loose stream of commentary about the ranch, the cattle market, the quality of the summer grass, and the particular stubbornness of the fence staples. Manuel worked without speaking, but had a way of meeting Levi's eye with a brief, approving nod, when something was done correctly, that communicated more than most men's full sentences. Ruth worked alongside them without ceremony. She was not a woman who stood back and supervised when work was available to be done. She had strong, capable hands, and she handled the fence tools with obvious practice, and when the wire cutter slipped and she cut her palm shallowly, she examined it briefly, pressed it against her skirt, and kept working until Levi came over and said, "Let me see that," with a firmness that surprised them both. She looked at him with those sharp eyes. "It is fine," she said. "I can see that it is not bleeding badly," he said, "but it should be wrapped before the dust gets in it." He pulled his clean handkerchief from his back pocket and held it out. There was a pause during which he was not sure if she was going to tell him again that it was fine and go back to work. Then she held out her hand and he wrapped it carefully, tying it off with a neat fold, and was aware the entire time of the exact quality of the silence between them, and of the fact that her hand was warm and strong, and that he was probably holding it with more care than was strictly necessary for bandaging purposes. "Thank you," she said, without the slight stiffness she had started the day with. Something had loosened. "You are welcome," he said, and they went back to work. At noon, Manuel's wife, Maria, had sent lunch with the brothers tortillas and beans, and a jar of pickled peppers that made Tomas beam with enormous pride as he presented them. And they all sat in the shade of the elm trees at the edge of the pasture and ate together. And it was one of those unremarkable midday meals that somehow contain a great deal of life. Levi told the brothers about his ranch in Santa Fe, and they told him about their family, 3 children each, a 4th coming for Manuel in the autumn. They talked about cattle prices and the state of the roads, and whether the railroad's expansion was going to be good or bad for a small independent rancher, which was a question everyone in the territory had strong opinions about. Ruth sat with her back against an elm trunk and ate and listened and occasionally spoke, and Levi found himself watching her in the way that he was beginning to understand was going to become a problem. The particular quality of attention you pay to someone you are trying to figure out, and whom you increasingly suspect you would like to have more time to figure out. After lunch, the brothers went back to the east pasture to finish the remaining fence section. Ruth walked back toward the house to start the afternoon's other work, and Levi fell into step beside her without making a particular decision to do so. "You are a good hand," she said, looking straight ahead. "Ranch work is ranch work," he said. "You did not have to stay and help. You came here to return a horse and I told you to keep it. That was the business between us." He thought about that. "Maybe the business between us was not quite finished," he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. Not with suspicion exactly, but with that careful, weighing look she had. "What does that mean precisely?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, choosing the words honestly. "It means that I have spent 10 years becoming someone I could be at peace with, and yesterday I came here to close the last thing that needed closing, and I did that. And now I am standing here and I am not entirely sure I want to close up and ride back to Santa Fe just yet." He paused. "That is the truth. I am not sure exactly what to do with it." Ruth looked at him for a long time. The afternoon wind moved through the grass and lifted the edge of her hat brim, and she put a hand up to steady it. "I have not had a reason to think carefully about a man in 3 years," she said, and her voice was careful but not unkind. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you for anything, Ruth. I would not do that. I am just telling you what is true." "I appreciate that," she said slowly. "Then, I would not be opposed to you staying another day. There is more fence to check on the north side, and Manuel and Tomas are good men, but they are only 2, and there is always more than 2 men's worth of work." She said this practically, looking away toward the barn. "If you wanted to be useful." "I would like to be useful," Levi said with perfect sincerity. That second evening, after supper, they sat on the porch in the cooling dark, and she brought out a lantern and a mending basket, and he sat on the steps with his back against the post, and they talked about things they had not talked about yet. About what it felt like to want something better and to work for it. About the loneliness of the territory and the strange beauty of it too. About the things you let yourself regret, and the things you decide to stop regretting, because regret without action is just a slow rot. "I have regretted Daniel's death without quite knowing what I was regretting," she said at some point, stitching by the lantern light. "Not him, I mean. I grieved him, I was fond of him, but something about the shape of what was supposed to come next. I had told myself a story about what my life was going to look like, and his dying closed that story before it was done, and I found myself having to write an entirely different one." "And how does this one read so far?" Levi asked. She looked at him over her mending with a slight, considering expression. "Ask me again in a year," she said. He laughed genuinely, quietly, and looked out at the dark prairie where the fireflies were beginning their summer business. "I will do that," he said. "I am holding you to it," she said, and went back to her mending. He stayed a 3rd day, and then a 4th. He did not decide to stay, exactly. Each morning simply arrived, and there was work to be done and supper to be made and conversation that had not exhausted itself, and leaving did not assert itself as the obvious next action in the way he had assumed it would. On the 5th day, Manuel pulled him aside in the barn with the directness of a man who has decided something is his business. "You are a good worker and Miss Ruth seems comfortable with you," Manuel said in his careful, deliberate English. "She is a good woman and she has had a hard time since her father and then her husband. If you are going to stay, stay honestly. If you are not, go before it costs her something." "I intend to be honest," Levi said. "I can see you intend it," Manuel said. "I am saying do not let intentions stay intentions forever. This is a woman who has learned to do everything herself because everything has been left to her. She does not need another person to be comfortable with and then have them ride away." Levi heard that. He heard it in the way you hear something that you already knew, but needed to be said by someone outside your own head. He thanked Manuel and went back to work and spent the morning thinking about what he was doing and what he actually wanted, and what those two things might realistically mean for a man who had a functioning ranch in New Mexico territory, and a woman in Kansas who had made it clear she was capable of operating her life without any help from him. That evening he stayed on the porch after supper longer than he had the previous nights, and he finally said to Ruth, who was also still on the porch, ostensibly looking at the stars, "I need to talk to you about something." "All right," she said. "I should tell you that I have a ranch in Santa Fe that is running well and needs me. I have a good foreman, a man named Garrett Chase, who can run it well without me for a time, but not indefinitely. I have been here 5 days, and I have not been thinking about that as much as I probably should." He paused. "I have been thinking about other things." Ruth said nothing for a moment. The night sounds of the prairie insects, a far-off coyote, the soft movement of horses in the pasture filled the space between them. "I have been thinking about other things too," she said at last, very quietly, like a fact she was reporting against her better judgment. "I know we are both too practical to be foolish about this," he said. "We might be," she agreed. "But I think I would like to come back," he said, "properly. If that is something you would consider, I could sort my affairs in Santa Fe. It would take me some weeks, and I could come back and spend some real time here, and we could see what this," he gestured vaguely at the space between them, "is or is not." Ruth was quiet. He could see the profile of her face in the starlight, the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders. She was thinking carefully, as she appeared to do about everything. He found he liked that about her enormously. "I think," she said finally, "that a person who rode 700 miles to right a wrong and then spent 5 days working my fence line for no particular reason has already demonstrated a certain quality of character that is worth considering." She paused. "I think you should go sort your affairs and come back. And I think when you come back, we will both know better what we are doing." "I think so too," he said. He left the next morning after breakfast, which Ruth made with the same efficient care she brought to everything. She packed him a cloth sack of food for the road: biscuits, dried venison, a jar of apple butter, without making it into a production. He saddled Juniper and led her out to the front of the house, and Ruth was standing on the porch, and the morning light was doing something extraordinary around her in the way that morning light in the territory sometimes did, all golden and clear and very large. He held Juniper's reins and looked at Ruth, and she looked at him, and there was a great deal in that moment that neither of them said, both of them being people who understood the value of letting things be what they actually were rather than pressing them to be more or less. "I will be back before the summer ends," he said. "The summer has about 8 weeks left," she said. "Then I will be back within 8 weeks." She nodded. Then, with the slight air of someone doing something on slight impulse but deciding to allow it, she came down the steps and put her hand out. He shook it, but held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, and she let him, and that was the whole of what passed between them, and yet it felt like the kind of thing that contains a whole future inside it. Juniper stepped sideways impatiently, and Levi smiled and mounted up and pointed her south toward the road. "Levi," Ruth called when he was a few yards away. He turned in the saddle. "I am glad you came back," she said, "for the horse, for the reason, for all of it." He settled his hat. "So am I," he said, and meant it down to the bone. The ride back to Santa Fe was not like the ride to Caldwell. He was not carrying guilt like a stone on this road. What he was carrying felt entirely different, lighter in some ways and more urgent in others, the particular weight of something beginning rather than something unresolved. He found himself making plans in the way he had not permitted himself to make plans for a long time, and when the New Mexico landscape began to reappear around him, familiar and rugged and beautiful in its own severe way, he felt it with new eyes, the eyes of a man measuring what he had against what he might want to change. Garrett Chase was a solidly capable man of 45 who had been foreman on the Santa Fe spread for 3 years, and who greeted Levi's return with the measured practicality of someone who had managed perfectly well in his absence and did not need to say so. Levi laid out his situation plainly. He intended to be away again in approximately 6 to 8 weeks, this time for a longer period, and he needed to know whether the ranch could sustain that and what arrangements needed to be made. Garrett studied him. "You meet someone in Kansas." "I returned a horse I had stolen 10 years ago," Levi said. "And," Garrett said, "the woman who owned it told me to keep the horse and explain myself." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, "And how long are you planning to be in Kansas?" "I do not know yet," Levi said honestly. "Long enough to find out what needs finding out." Garrett nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has assessed a situation and found it reasonable. "I can run the operation through winter without you if it comes to that," he said. "Spring calving I would need you back, or I would need an additional hand." "I will be back by spring calving regardless," Levi said, and knew as he said it that he was hoping the reason for the return would be a great deal larger than managing livestock. The weeks in Santa Fe were busy and necessary. He was not, by nature, a man who could leave things half done, and there was a great deal of organizational work to do before he could leave the ranch in good conscience for an extended period. He spent them reviewing accounts, ordering supplies for the winter, repairing the main fence line on the north pasture, hiring a second hand for the fall season, and writing 3 letters. The first letter was to Ruth, which he labored over for an embarrassingly long time, given that he was a man who had no difficulty speaking directly to people in person, and some difficulty translating that directness onto paper. He settled finally on a letter that told her he was making arrangements and would be back no later than the last week of August. He told her a few things about the ranch, the specific geography of it, the quality of the morning light over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the way the Rio Grande looked in late summer when the snowmelt from the mountains was done. He was not sure why he told her these things. He thought she would understand that he was showing her something, and he thought she would make of it what it was. The second letter was to a lawyer in Caldwell, whose name he had gotten from a business directory, asking a preliminary question about the process of transferring property interests between states. The third letter was to his sister in Missouri, telling her something general had changed for the better, which was all she needed to know for now. Ruth wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast for the distance, and suggested she had sent the letter within a few days of receiving his. Her letter was direct and not flowery, which he had expected. She told him the north fence was finished, and the east pasture was looking good, and that Tomas had made an offer on the land parcel adjacent to the Blackwell property, which she thought was sound if he could manage the financing. She mentioned a thunderstorm that had been spectacular. She said the summer had been drier than usual, but the cattle were in fair condition. At the very end, in a sentence that was written in slightly different handwriting from the rest, the writing of a woman who had paused before writing and started again, she said she had looked at the South Road most evenings since he left and found the habit somewhat irritating, and thought he should know so he could decide what to do with the information. He read that sentence 4 times. He then went outside and stood in the New Mexico evening air for a while, and looked at the mountains and thought about what he was going to do with the information. And what he was going to do was fairly clear, and it was also considerably more than he had allowed himself to think directly about up until this point. He wrote back that evening, and the letter he wrote was, perhaps, less controlled than his first one. He told her he had found himself looking at the North Road with a similar and equally inconvenient habit, and that the mountains were beautiful, but that he thought Kansas had something the mountains did not, and that he thought it was her, and that he was going to say that directly because he was 32 years old and done saying things around the edges of what he actually meant. He set out for Caldwell on the 24th of August, 1884, with Juniper, a pack horse loaded with supplies and his good clothes, and Garrett Chase standing at the gate of the Santa Fe ranch with an expression that suggested he thought the whole enterprise was sensible and hoped the man would not make a mess of it. The ride north through New Mexico and into Kansas was different in every way from the ride he had made before. He was not carrying guilt. He was not rehearsing. He was riding toward something rather than toward an obligation, and Juniper seemed to sense the difference, keeping a strong, willing pace through the long days. He arrived at the Blackwell property on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. The cottonwoods along the South Fork Road had begun their first turn toward gold. The sky was enormous and clear and very blue. The white gate was open when he arrived, which meant Manuel and Tomas were likely working somewhere on the property, and he rode through without stopping and up the long approach road. Ruth came out of the barn, not the house, when he was still 30 yards from it, and she had a bridle in one hand and a look on her face that she corrected slightly when she saw him, the way a person corrects their expression when they realize someone has seen what was there before they put the useful face on. He appreciated that she did not manage it entirely, that something of the real expression remained. He dismounted. She walked toward him. They stopped a reasonable distance apart and looked at each other in the September afternoon light. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "People say things. I mean what I say." She looked at him for a moment longer with those eyes that calculated the depth of things. Then she said, "Come, put your horse up. Supper is in an hour." He knew by the way she said it, the ease of it, the simple assumption of his welcome, that something had been decided, not then but over the weeks since he had left, and that the deciding had been done by both of them at a distance, in letters, and in the quiet habits of looking at roads that ran in the direction of someone else. That evening at supper, she told him that she had been thinking about the ranch. Not about changes, she was not asking him for anything, but about the future of it, about what she wanted the next 10 years to look like. She had thought about whether she wanted to expand, whether she wanted to bring on a full-time additional hand, whether the cattle operation was the right primary focus, or whether the horse breeding aspect of it, which her father had started and she had maintained at a small scale, might be worth developing. Levi listened with the full attention he had learned to give to things that mattered. He asked careful questions. He offered thoughts when she invited them, and did not when she was simply thinking aloud, and he understood the difference because he had been paying attention. After supper they were on the porch again, but this time the conversation had loosened into something warmer and less careful. She told him about growing up on this land, about her mother who had died when Ruth was 12, about learning the ranch from her father who had been both demanding and devoted. He told her about his own family, a crowded Missouri household that had sent him west at 19, with nothing but a strong back and more stubbornness than sense. He told her about the worst years, the ones where the wrong choices had piled up, and he told it without self-pity and without making excuses, just plainly, because she deserved to know what had made him, and he had learned that truth was the only foundation worth building on. She listened in the way she did everything with her whole, quiet attention. "You are a very different man from who you were at 22, she said when he finished. "I should hope so," he said. 22 years old and stealing horses in the dark. "People do worse," she said. "People do better," he said. She looked at him with a slight smile. "You are hard on yourself. Only when it's warranted." "Is it still warranted?" He thought about it honestly. "Less than it was," he said. "Less than it was a year ago. Less than it was when I started riding north in July." He looked at her directly. "Sitting here with you takes some of the warrant out of it." The silence after that was a different kind of silence from the ones they had had before. She was looking at her folded hands, and then she looked up at him, and the evening was warm and still around them. "I want to say something, and I am going to say it plainly," she said, "because you said in your letter that you were done saying things around the edges, and I think you were right about that." "All right," he said. "I have been cautious about people," she said, "about letting them in. My father died, and then Daniel died, and I became very good at doing everything alone, and I also became very good at telling myself that was fine, that I preferred it. And mostly it was fine, and mostly I did prefer it to the alternative, which was needing someone who might leave or be taken. She paused. "But I have been thinking about you since June, Levi, and I have written you letters that said more than I usually let myself say to people, and you came back the day you said you would, and I think what I am trying to tell you is that I would like to stop being cautious about you specifically." He was very still for a moment. The night insects were singing and the stars above the prairie were beginning to take on their September sharpness, that crystalline quality the high plains sky developed in the cooling end of summer. "I think that is the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever said to me," he said quietly. "It is just the truth," she said. "The best things usually are." He reached across the small space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and her fingers closed around his with a certainty that had nothing hesitant in it. They sat there for a long time in the September evening, not saying much, not needing to. The following weeks settled into a pattern that felt, to Levi, like the best version of something he had been looking for without quite knowing what it was. He worked the ranch alongside Manuel and Tomas, and he became a presence on the property that was natural and necessary and welcome. Ruth ran her operation with the same clear-eyed competence she brought to everything, and he learned quickly that his role was not to manage or direct, but to support and work alongside, and he found that suited him perfectly. He had never been interested in the kind of man who needed to be in charge of everything. In the evenings they talked, or read. She had a small shelf of books that she had read many times, and he borrowed them and they argued companionably about their opinions of them, which was more fun than he had expected, or sat on the porch in the cooling autumn evenings while the prairie darkened and deepened around them. One afternoon in mid-October, they rode out together to check the cattle in the far north pasture, a 2-hour ride that took them through some of the most open and beautiful country on the property. Ruth rode a steady gray gelding she called Prospect, and she rode well, with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up on horseback. They rode side by side and the country opened up around them, and the sky was doing the particular autumn thing it does in Kansas, deep blue, enormous, the light slanting gold and sharp. And at some point they had both stopped talking and were just riding, and Levi looked at the back of her hands on the reins and the way her hair caught the light under the brim of her hat and felt something that was equal parts contentment, and a wanting so specific and clear it was almost a shock. He said, "Ruth." She looked at him. "I love you," he said, with exactly the directness he had promised himself. Not as a declaration designed to impress, just as a plain fact that needed to be said because it was true and because she deserved to hear it. Ruth reined Prospect to a stop. He stopped Juniper beside her. She was looking at the horizon with that expression she had when she was deciding something, and he waited with the patience of someone who understood that this woman would not be rushed and should not be. "I know," she said at last, still looking at the horizon. Then she looked at him and her dark eyes were very clear. "I know because I feel the same thing and I recognize it by how frightening it is." A small pause. "I love you too, Levi." He reached over and she reached over and they were both leaning sideways in their saddles, and it was not graceful, but it was also absolutely the most honest thing he had ever done. The way he kissed her out there in the open Kansas autumn. And Juniper and Prospect both stood with complete unconcern, as if people on horseback were always doing this, and it required no particular comment. When they pulled apart, Ruth laughed a genuine full laugh and pressed her hand briefly to her face, and he grinned at her like an absolute fool and felt no inclination whatsoever to stop. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "Let us go look at the cattle," she said, and turned Prospect north. But she was smiling as she went, and he rode beside her and the prairie was golden around them, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. He proposed to her in November on the porch, which had become their place in the way that certain places become certain people's places, gathered up in the ordinary accumulation of evenings spent there. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small inlaid garnet, which his sister in Missouri had sent when he wrote, and told her he thought he had found someone worth everything. He produced it without excessive ceremony because Ruth was not a woman who liked excessive ceremony, and he said exactly what he meant, which was that he wanted to marry her and spend the rest of his life on this land with her if she would have him, and that he would sell the Santa Fe ranch and make Caldwell his permanent home, and that he had already discussed this with Garrett Chase, who had taken the news with complete equanimity. Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking at the ring on his palm. Then she put her hand out and he placed it on her finger. She looked at it in the lamp light. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." Then, with the slight edge of humor that was one of the best things about her, "Did you really think the answer was going to be no?" "I was not certain," he said, which was true. "The answer was always going to be yes," she said. "I was just waiting for you to catch up to it." He laughed and pulled her close, and she let herself be held in the way she had recently permitted herself to do, with the particular ease of someone who had stopped fighting the thing they needed. They were married in December 1884 in the Caldwell church, a small wedding which suited both of them, attended by Manuel and Tomas and their families, a few of Ruth's closest neighbors, and the town minister who had known her father and was visibly moved by the whole occasion. Ruth wore a dress of dark green wool that she had made herself, which Levi thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he said so, and she told him he was biased, and he said absolutely and without apology. The winter was a good one, cold and clean-aired, the kind of Kansas winter that drives you indoors and keeps you there, and being kept indoors with Ruth turned out to be one of the more pleasant experiences of Levi's adult life. They learned the particular rhythms of sharing a house with someone, the small negotiations and adjustments of two independent people building something together, and managed it remarkably well because they had both started from a place of honesty and continued from there. Garrett Chase handled the sale of the Santa Fe ranch in the spring, and it sold well. The territory was growing and the land had value, and the proceeds came to Levi in the form of a bank draft in April that represented a decade of work and was enough to properly fund an expansion of the Blackwell operation. He brought it to Ruth, and they laid it on the kitchen table and looked at it together and then looked at each other. "This is ours," he said, "not mine. Whatever we decide to do with it, we decide together." She looked at him with an expression he recognized by now as the one that preceded her saying something she felt deeply. "Levi," she said, "you understand that you already gave up everything you had built to come here." "I gave up a ranch to come here," he said. "I got something considerably better." They put half the money into the horse breeding operation, which had been Ruth's vision since before he arrived, building a proper breeding program around Juniper's bloodline, which was genuinely excellent. Tennessee walking stock with the stamina and temperament that made working ranch horses. They put the other half into expanding the grazing capacity of the property, buying the adjacent parcel that Tomas had identified and adding it to the Blackwell holdings. Manuel and Tomas became permanent full-time hands, which they had effectively been for some time, and Levi made sure their wages reflected that properly, something Ruth had been trying to manage on tighter margins before the additional capital came in. Manuel accepted the raise with the quiet dignity of a man who had always known it was owed and had been patient about it, and Tomas accepted it with considerably more expressive enthusiasm, which included a speech that went on for 5 minutes and involved several compliments for both Levi and Ruth that were entirely genuine and very entertaining. In the summer of 1885, Ruth told Levi she was pregnant, and she told him in the way she told him most important things, directly, without preamble, watching his face for the response. The response she got was a man who sat down slowly at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands, not from distress, but from the kind of overwhelming gratitude that sometimes needs a moment to find its shape, and then looked up with an expression that she would describe later to Manuel's wife Maria as the most purely happy face she had ever seen on a grown man. Their son was born in February 1886, a cold Kansas morning with Maria Cortez serving as midwife and Levi pacing the length of the downstairs hallway with absolutely no dignity whatsoever, until the crying of a newborn announced that something had arrived. They named him Walter, for Ruth's father, and Levi felt the rightness of that name in a way that was connected to everything, to the old man who had died with an unresolved wound, to the horse, to the long road back, to the thing he had built from the rubble of what he had once been. Walter was a substantial, loud baby with Ruth's dark eyes and Levi's broad hands, and he entered the world with an opinion about everything and no hesitation whatsoever in expressing it. Manuel visited and called him a strong boy, and sat with the kind of warmth that comes from a man who has children of his own. Tomas visited and told Walter, at considerable length, everything he would eventually need to know about horses, fence lines, and the unreliability of Kansas weather, and Walter regarded him with the unfocused but intent expression of a baby who appeared to be taking notes. The ranch grew. The horse breeding program, which they called Blackwell Granger stock, and which was known in the territory within 3 years for the quality of its working horses, became the principal pride of the operation. Juniper, now an elder stateswoman of the pasture, had one more foal at 12, a filly with her mother's spotted markings and her grandfather's Tennessee temperament, and then retired to a life of grass and sun, and the occasional short trail ride on which Levi would take her out just for the pleasure of it, the way you do with something that has been with you through the long passage from who you were to who you became. In the spring of 1887, Ruth told Levi again, in the same direct kitchen table fashion, that another child was coming. He responded with less pacing this time and more immediate gratitude. Their second child, a girl they named Elena for no one in particular, just because the name suited her from the first moment she appeared, small and fierce and fully decided about herself, arrived in October, and proceeded to conduct herself with the same opinions as her brother but a great deal more strategic precision. The territory around Caldwell was changing, as all the territory was changing. The cattle drives that had built the town were diminishing as the range was fenced and the railheads moved, and Caldwell would have to decide what it became next, as all the frontier towns were having to decide. Levi watched this with the measured attention of a man who had seen the land at various stages of its development, and understood that what endured was what was built on something real good soil, honest work, fair dealing with the people around you. He thought sometimes, in the particular way you think about things when you have come far enough from them to see them clearly, about the young man who had been in this territory in 1874, who had been desperate and reckless, and had made a choice that cost someone something, and had cost himself considerably more over the years than the thing he had gained. He thought about how close he had come, in various moments along the way, to simply staying the person he had been, to deciding that the past was past, and the guilt was just a thing you got used to carrying and left it at that. He did not think you could get used to carrying it. He thought it wore you down in ways you did not always notice until you were already worn. One evening in the spring of 1888, he was sitting on the porch with Walter beside him. The boy was just past 2, with big interested eyes and a habit of sitting next to Levi in what was clearly an attempt to occupy as much physical space as possible for his size. And Ruth came out and handed him a coffee and sat in her chair, and they looked at the long gold evening together, the cottonwoods down the South Fork Road just beginning to show their spring green against the wide pale sky. "What are you thinking about?" Ruth asked. She had gotten very good at reading when he was somewhere in his thoughts, and she asked with the particular warmth of someone who genuinely wanted to know. "The horse," he said. "Juniper," she said, "and 10 years ago, and the whole long road from there to here." He looked at his son, who was now attempting to stand on the porch railing with no success and no diminishment of ambition. "I think about what I nearly didn't do, nearly talked myself out of coming back more times than I can count." Ruth reached over and put her hand on his arm. "But you came back." "But I came back. What was the thing that made you? She asked, not for the first time, but in different ways on different evenings, as if she were triangulating something. He thought about how to answer it, and the answer he arrived at was the same one he always arrived at, which was that it was not one thing. It was the accumulation of them. The year the ranch first turned a profit and he stood in the field he had earned and felt the specific misalignment of pride and guilt. It was the news of Walter Blackwell's death, which had landed in him like a door closing that he had been meaning to walk through. It was the simple, exhausting weight of carrying a thing for 10 years and realizing that the only way to put it down was to go back to where you had picked it up. I think I came back because I finally understood that a man cannot be at peace with himself while he is at war with something he has done, he said. And I wanted peace more than I wanted to avoid the discomfort of coming back. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Walter had given up on the railing and was now pulling very determinedly at Levi's bootlaces, which he allowed because it kept the boy occupied. "And did you find it?" she said. "The peace?" He looked at her at the lamp light and the evening and the woman he had ridden 700 miles of guilt toward and found here on this porch in this country, who had told him to keep the horse and explain himself, and then proceeded to become the best thing in his life with the same quiet, direct competence she brought to everything. "Yes," he said, "I found considerably more than that." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was a thing she did when she was happy and did not need to say it, and he pressed his cheek against her hair for a moment, and then they both looked back out at the evening, which was by now a deep rose and gold over the hills, the kind of sunset that the territory was capable of in early spring when everything was just beginning to open up. Juniper was visible in the near pasture, grazing with the unhurried authority of an animal who had earned her ease. Her gray muzzle caught the last light, and her spotted coat was warm-colored in the sunset, and she looked, as she always had, like a piece of good country walking around on 4 legs. Levi thought about the night he had taken her, 22 years old and foolish and desperate, slipping through the dark with his heart hammering and the horse following him because she was a trusting animal, and he had been taking advantage of that trust. He thought about the long years between then and the moment he had ridden back up the South Fork Road with her. He thought about everything that had been waiting at the end of that road, not just the reckoning he had dreaded, but the whole of this life, this woman, this porch, this sun tugging on his boot, this evening, this ongoing expansion of good things that he would spend the rest of his days tending with everything he had. A man could argue that stealing the horse was where the story started, but Levi thought the story started when he decided to bring her back. Everything before that was just the prologue, the years of becoming someone who could make a different choice than the choices he had made before. The prairie was going dark around the property, the wide Kansas dark that had stars in it before it was fully night, and the white gate at the end of the approach road caught the last of the light and glowed against the deepening blue of the South Fork Road. Manuel and Maria's lamplight was visible a quarter-mile away at the foreman's house they had built the previous year, a good solid structure that Levi and Tomas had helped raise over 3 hard-working autumn days. Tomas's place was just beyond it, a smaller house he had moved into after his wedding in the spring. His new wife, a quiet, sharp-witted woman from Wichita who had taken to ranch life with a speed that impressed everyone. Inside the house behind them, Alina was presumably doing the thing she did most evenings, which was refusing to sleep until she had satisfied herself that everything in her small world was in its correct state. They would hear her shortly, and Ruth would go in and there would be the small, familiar negotiation of bedtime, and then the house would be quiet. Walter had fallen asleep against Levi's leg, because 2-year-olds have no concept of the poetic moment and simply go to sleep when they are tired regardless of the quality of the sunset. Levi put a hand on the boy's back and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing. "We should talk about expanding the south pasture," Ruth said, after a while, because she was Ruth Granger now, and she never truly stopped thinking about the ranch, which was one of the things he loved most about her. Tomas thinks the creek bed is moving south about a yard a year. If we fence it now before it shifts too far, we will keep the water access. I have been thinking the same thing, Levi said. We should also look at the breeding schedule for next spring. Juniper's filly is going to be of age. She is, Ruth agreed. I have been writing to a breeder in Texas about a stallion. His bloodlines are from Virginia, good endurance stock. Show me the letter. In the morning. In the morning, he agreed. The stars were properly out now, thick and brilliant overhead, the kind of sky that the Great Plains gave you when the air was clear, and you were far enough from town for the darkness to be real darkness. Levi leaned back in his chair and looked up at them with the deep, uncomplicated appreciation of a man who had found the place in the world where he was meant to be and knew it. He thought about the question of what a man owed, to the people he had wronged, to the places he had taken from, to the general account of decent behavior he was supposed to be maintaining in his passage through the world. He thought he had paid what he owed, or as much of it as could be paid. He thought that the paying of it, the actual turning of the horse around and riding back north, had been the thing that broke open the better part of his life and let the light in. There was something in that worth knowing, that the hardest road back sometimes led to the best place forward. The child on his leg shifted and made a small, contented sound in his sleep. Ruth picked up her coffee cup and looked at the stars with the same attention she gave everything. Somewhere out in the pasture, Juniper moved through the dark grass, a moving constellation of spots that caught the starlight as she went. Levi Granger sat on the porch of the Blackwell Granger ranch in the first dark of a spring evening in 1888, his family around him and his hands at rest and his conscience finally, fully, completely at peace. And he thought that this, all of this, the work and the love and the land and the ongoing, ordinary miracle of a life lived honestly, was what a man came back for. Not just to return a horse, to return to himself. And to find, waiting at the end of that road, everything he had not known he was riding toward. The lamp in the kitchen window threw a warm square of gold across the porch. Aliner's voice came faintly from inside, announcing some small, emphatic opinion about the state of the world. Ruth stood, unhurried, and leaned down and kissed the top of Levi's head with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times and intends to do it 10,000 more, and then went inside to tend to their daughter. Levi sat with his sleeping son and looked at the stars over Kansas, and the night was full of good things, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.